Wysteria, energy, twister. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel and the world of fairies. We are now on the F's, and our first one is the Fachan, also known as the Fachen, the Fajin, and Peg Leg Jack, a breed of fairy from West Highlands of Scotland. The Fachan are described as being ugly. A hand protrudes from the chest. Thick fur covers their body, and they have only one leg and eye. They dress in a girdle of deerskins, donned in a mantle of blue feathers, as they are jealous of fairies capable of flight. Some lore claims the Fachan are so physically repulsive, seeing one may induce a heart attack. An expert leaper, the Fachan are not nearly as agile as a person. Known for their malevolent disposition and hating all living things, they carry a spiked club they use liberally when chasing people out of their territory. It will also use its club's wickedly spiked chain to destroy an entire orchard in a single night. A Fachan, from the popular Highland tale, is told of Nesnas MacCallin. Fada, also known as Heda and Hadada. Fada is the provincial word in both the Italian and Spanish languages for fairies. In the south of France, the Fada were considered to be a species of fairy well known to take a human lover. If a man who had a Fada for a lover ever married a mortal woman, his bride would die before the marriage could be consummated. Fafnir. Fafnir was a son of the magician dwarf king, and he also had brothers in Norse mythology. The most aggressive and strongest of the brothers was Fafnir, and he was blessed with a fearless soul and a powerful arm. He also wore the Aegis helmet, and he guarded his father's house of gems and gold. Driven by greed, Fafnir killed his father in front of his two sisters for possession of the hoard and transformed into a dragon to better guard it. Ultimately, he was slain by the cultural hero Sigurd. Fair family. Variations. Fair folk. Till of Teg. The term fair family is a euphemistic phrase used by the Welsh when referring to the fairies. Fair lady. A very powerful species of fairy from Hungarian folklore, a fair lady will often shapeshift into a beautiful horse, naked woman, or a long-haired woman dressed in white, looking like a typical housewife. These fairies will walk through a town looking for a home to stay in. When invited into one, it will cast a spell and strike the homeowner deaf, mute, or worse. Each fair lady also has a magical platter, some item enchanted, such as a spoon, an actual platter, or even a puddle of water on the ground. Anyone who touches one of these platters will fall under its injurious and malicious spells. To see a fairy lady is an omen of our times approaching when one is seen. It's often said she is dancing in the rain or flying in embers through the sky. Known to steal children, the fair ladies have an irresistible singing voice. They will use to lure a man into its arms and then systematically dance to death. Like many of the fae, the fair ladies are repelled by church bells, the use of the Lord's name, and also human laughter. So there you go. All you need to do is laugh. Bingo. You've scared that one away. And we're not going to do the word fairy because, as I said, fairy in general, remember, is not the meaning for a single being. A fairy in general is the meaning of many beings, not just one. It just means otherworldly beings. That's all it means. Fairy bush. In British fairy law, any bush growing in the direct path of a fairy reed or a fairy trail was called a fairy bush and considered untouchable. Some of those plants remained intact for ages. Common species of fairy bushes were elderberry, holly, maybush, rowan, and whitethorn. If ever the wood of one of these bushes was burned for fuel, it would spit sparks and send forth a noxious fume, which would cause anyone who inhaled it to linger in sickness before they finally died. That's nice, isn't it? Fairy Fort. Found all over Ireland, a fairy fort was the remains of a hill fort or some other circular dwelling. Most of these locations date back to the Iron Age. At one time, there were said to be as many as 60,000 such locations over the country. Fairies were said to frequent these locations, thereby giving the name. It was believed damage to these ancient sites would anger the fairies who dwelt within. It would cause some disaster to befall the perpetrator. Fairy forts were also believed to be entryways to fairyland. Fairy godmother, also known as Samarin Fi. A fairy godmother was a good-natured fairy, first popularised in the French fairy tale Cinderella, from the latter half of the 17th century. The story's origin is ancient and unknown, but the fairy godmother was a concept well familiar to the peasants who believed fairies could be invited into a person's life and become an active participant in it. The fairy godmother as a character in folklore and fairy tales acts as a personal mentor, a surrogate mother, delivering a loving and nurturing relationship. Typically, the person being helped is a young maiden whose own mother is deceased. In the 18th century, she became a relentless moralist. The fairy godmother will help the maiden achieve her goal and fulfill her needs, so she will be able to win her prize. Typically, the love and protection of her husband, who will stand up for her against her enemies and help her claim her birthright. In very old fairy tales, the fairy godmother is actually the returned spirit of the maiden's mother, which is true actually. You can go back and there's, like I said, there's, for the first Cinderella, no one really knows where it came from because it's a very old tale and it was only brought back in those centuries. But if you go far enough back and research, the fairy godmother used to be the deceased mother returning in spirit form, which makes a lot of sense really to me. Fairy loaf. A fairy loaf is, according to law, a loaf of bread a fairy gives to a mortal out of charity. The loaf will always remain fresh, never reduce in size, so long as some condition is met, such as never revealing the source of the loaf or ensuring your children always eat a slice. Fossilised sea urchins are called fairy loaves, and there is a saying in Norfolk, if you keep a fairy loaf, you will never want bread. Interestingly, fairies are also a euphemism referred to as urchins. Fairy money. In all of folklore, legends and stories involving fairies and money, it is important to note the money they offer is perfectly good and by all measures actual currency, as long as the source of the income was kept a secret. Should ever the recipient of the gift tell anyone how he came into it, the money and all purchase with it would instantly vanish. Fairy of the Beech Woods. In the fairy tale Prince Featherhead and the Princess Calendine by Lee Prince Muggle, the fairy of the Beech Woods lived in a lonely valley, where a kind but displaced king and queen took refuge with their infant son. The fairy put the royal family under her protection. The fairy of the Beech Woods lived in a leafy palace, an enchanted place filled with treasures. She had the ability to send dreams and mask visibly a person's appearance, causing them to appear unattractive. It's interesting. The chariot that this fairy had was dressed with honeysuckle and jasmine. Fairy of the Dawn. In the fairy tale Fairy of the Dawn, this was Romanian, the nymph-like Fairy of the Dawn was the guardian of a fountain whose water contained magical properties. To reach the fountain, one must pass the three-headed fire-breathing dragon, defeat the evil Welwa goblin of the Copper Woods, the Welwa of the Silver Woods, and the Welwa of the Gold Woods, safely pass through the frozen and icy kingdom of the goddess Mythology. That's the feminine form of the Roman god Mercury. They must pass safely through the kingdom of the goddess of thunder, Donnerstag, the feminine form of the Roman god Jupiter. And finally, through the kingdom of Venera, the feminine form of the Roman god Venus. It's interesting, isn't it, how we find that they do all connect when you think about it. They just have different names, and it's like whether they are man or woman, it doesn't matter. They all seem to blend together, really, just have different names and different genders sometimes. Fairy Raid. A fairy raid is a grand procession of the fae, and such an event occurring is considered to be of great importance. Although a raid can occur any time of the year, they are especially significant when they occur on the onset of summer. Typically, these raids consist of fairies wearing their finest clothes and riding upon their favourite mounts that are equally adorned with resplendent trappings. Sometimes ghosts and witches are said to accompany the fae. In ancient times, it was believed Gwenllian, the fairy king, led many a fairy raid out of fairyland through a portal on Glastonbury Tor. And it's true. And should you ever come across a fairy raid, then maybe do not try and make yourself known. Because sometimes they're okay, sometimes they're not, you know. Fairy triad. In the Celtic fairy tradition, a fairy triad is a place where ash, oak and thorn trees are all growing together. When this occurs, it is considered to be a sacred grove and a place inhabited by the dryads. Carrying a small bundle of oak and thorn twigs bound together with black, red and white thread will offer protection against this fae. And again, that's something you have to try yourself and let us know. Ballerina. A Ballerina is the other fate to her sister, Dragontina. They're very beautiful, but they're powerful and they are haughty enchantresses. So they're kind of like a sign of divinity as well, though, and they can do all kinds of different magic. Fair, known as socket, also Fal, was one of the many dwarfs named in the Voluspa. Falserina, also known as Felicinda. Falserina is the fairy of fortune or gold in the Donna Marini. Later she becomes identified as the fairy of romance. Falserina falls in love with the beautiful mortal, Adonis, and keeps him as a prisoner in a garden of pleasure. In spite of her natural beauty and use of magical elixirs and spells, Adonis does not return her affections. Enraged, Falserina transforms the youth into a parrot and forces him to watch love scenes between Mars and Venus. Fand, a Manx deity absorbed in Irish mythology. Fand, the greatest of the Irish fairy queens, the pearl of beauty, and a minor goddess of earthly pleasures, health, and the sea, was once married to Manannan, the god of the sea. When her husband abandoned her, Fand was challenged by 3 Fomorian warriors in a battle for control of the Irish Sea. Unable to win, she beseeched the cultural hero Cuchulainn to fight for her, but he would not agree to do so unless she agreed to marry him. Reluctantly, the Sea consented. As soon as the two met, they fell deeply in love with one another. Manannan knew if a relationship between a fairy and a mortal continued, it would ultimately destroy the fae. Using his magical mantle, he erased the memory of the lovers from each other's minds. And there is variations of that story, just so we're clear. Many different variations, but that's just one of them. Fantine. In Swiss fairy lore, in the springtime, the Fantines of the Valley would watch over and water the flowers as they bloomed, a type of nature spirit. The Fantines were also concerned with the welfare of the herds that grazed in the alpine pastures. Fardaric. Fardaric was a fairy, practical joke from Irish folklore, and he presides over evil dreams and nightmares. Farfadet. In the folklore of Brittany, the Farfadet sprite is a species of goblin or lutin. These small, furry, kindly fairies not only guard treasure but also help out around the house, but sometimes they can be a little bit mischievous. Foravan was a green fairy dog from the folklore of Scotland. According to legend, it was as large as a 2-year-old heifer and was once set loose on Hugh MacLeod, who had stolen a fairy chalice. The dog will bay 3 times when on the hunt, pausing between each sonorous howl. The sound of it could strike fear in a man's heart. The tail of the Farvan was said to sometimes curl up over its back, while other times it was braided in a long plait. The fairy dog was said to act as guardian to the entryway of fairyland, and would accompany fairy women as they went out to fetch milk, moving in perfect silence. Farvan's paw prints were as large as a man's hand. And then we move on to Fata, the Incantatrice. Italian poetry. There are 2 classifications of the fates. The first is benign and protective of mankind, while the other is malicious and seductive. The words fata, incantatrice, and maga are used freely and interchangeably to describe each group of these beings. So, for example, there's Fata della Fonte, is one of the fates from the poem, and it's in 1495 it was written. She assists Mandricardo in obtaining the love of Hector. Then there's Fata Morgana, said to be the sister of King Arthur and taught magic by the sorcerer Merlin. Fata Morgana was introduced as a fate in Matteo Maria Bordeaux's epic poem, again 1495, called Orlando in Love. Initially as Lady Fortune, she is portrayed as an enchantress in the poem. In Tasso, 3 daughters are introduced also, Caviglia, Nivetta, and Morganetta. Fata Morgana is also said to be the fairy presumed to have caused the mirages in the straits of Messina. Then there's also the fate Fata Silvanella. She's presented as an enchantress as well, but together they are actually called the Fates. Fati or Fatit, or also known as Miren. This is a type of birth fairy from southern Albanian lore. Beautiful and extremely powerful, these female fairies are small enough to ride on the back of a butterfly. It was believed 3 Fatit appear to a child 3 days after its birth to determine its destiny. Those are the fairies that you would associate looking like Tinkerbell, basically. Faun, Faunus, and Faunus. A fairy animal from Roman mythology, the faun is often associated with Greek satyrs and the Greek god Pan, or Faunus. Described as a horned human from the waist up and a goat from the waist down. This nature spirit would guide those who were lost in the woods or terrorise those who travelled through the woods. It depends on the fairies' whimsy, how it feels. Fauns, the fairy creatures, should not be confused with the Roman god Faunus, nor the goddess Fauna. Little bit different, you see. Not quite the same, I'm afraid. Fia Dorig, Fia Darig, also known as Fia Diag, and Donegal. A Fia Darig, meaning red man, is a fairy from Irish folklore, and his appearance actually really does vary, but is said to look like a wizened gnome, standing only 2.5 feet tall. Long grey hair, wears a scarlet coat, and a sugarloaf hat. He goes from home to home and begs to warm himself by the fire. Good luck falls to those who let him in. When Fiadarag has red hair, it is said he is a practical joker. However, when this fae wears all red and calls himself Fia Dirk of Donegal, he is especially ill-behaved. Not only is a practical joker, but will use cruel and evil hallucinations in some law. Fia Dirk is a species of fairy and not an individual being. Fia Gota, also known as Fagota, Gota man. Irish folklore. The Fia Gota, hungry man, is a fairy spirit, possibly the ghost of someone who has died of hunger. Standing by the roadside, he begs for food. Anyone who gives him an offering is blessed with good fortune. However, it is believed in Kitulbrid, a Fia Gota is a sudden onset of hunger occurring to a person while they travel through the mountains. If this hunger is not quickly satisfied, the situation could be fatal. So I guess what that's saying is if they don't eat when they are hungry and travelling, then they'll turn sort of insane or you turn into one of those fairies, I guess. That's kind of what it means anyway. I'm assuming. Fee, also known as corrigans, fetes and fions. In Upper Brittany, fairies are called fees. However, in Brenton, fairies are divided in two classes. The fee fairies and the nains, dwarfs in Normandy. Fee will steal children and leave a changeling in its place. Don't they all do that though? More or less. Feorin. The Feorin are a type of very small fairy found in the folklore of England. They are described as wearing green coats and red hats. The Feorin love to dance inside fairy rings. Fils de Holes. The Fils de Holes, fairies of the hills or billows, in Upper Brittany lived in grottos or natural caves along the sea cliffs, particularly near St. Cast. They are said to be storm fairies and dress themselves in all the colours of the rainbow. Before a storm, their fairy queen will leave their fairyland and head up a fairy raid upon a boat made from Nautilus of the South Seas. Her boat is drawn by twin crabs. The Fenodere, also known as the Fenodiri, Fenodire, Fenodari, and the Foldiagaste. They're a species of brownie from the Isle of Man, sort of meaning nimble mower. They're an expert farming fairy. They were extremely strong and were said to take great enjoyment in ploughing fields, reaping crops, sowing seeds. At night, during snowy weather, they would gather in the sheep for the family. Fialfi. In Ireland, the locals who reside around Lugia believed the red-haired dwarf Fialfi was the ruler of the Law and not Geroid. Fialfi, a highly skilled shapeshifter who often took the form of a beaten seahee or brownie, was born from the son of Igabel, the brother to the fairy queen Anne. Apparently these fairies were expert three-string harpists, and when it was played like sleep music, everyone who heard it would fall into a very deep sleep. But when he played something like delightful music, laughter music, listeners would burst into fits of laughter. Wow, can you imagine that? Ferusa, a sea nymph from Greek mythology. Ferusa was one of the Nereids who sports in the devious contortions. She was born the daughter of Nereus and Doris. Feu follet. In the fairy lore of Quebec, the feu follets are species of injurious and vicious nature spirits that enjoy playing tricks on mortals. Described as looking like blue flame, these fairy spirits lure travellers into ponds, and then they intend to drown them. Well, that's nice, isn't it? Don't you just love how fairies seem to want to do a lot of bad? Not many seem to want to do a lot of good. Then again, they are just myths, guys. don't believe everything you read. Generally, there is a way you can approach a fairy, and there is a way you should not approach a fairy. It's always best to just learn and go with your gut. Definitely. Thank you for listening to this part of the Encyclopedia of the World of Fairies. Please hit that like, share if you can, and if you've not yet subscribed, please consider doing so. Many blessings.
Wysteria, energy, twister.